The crackling sound of wood splintering echoed through the neighborhood as Emma Dawson froze in place, her heart pounding like a war drum. She wasn't sure what she'd heard at first. An accident? A break-in? Or something worse? Her instincts screamed danger. It was only 6:30 a.m., and the sleepy cul-de-sac was bathed in the soft amber hues of dawn. But the unease was undeniable. Just as Emma stepped closer to her front window to peer outside, a figure bolted past her yard, clutching something tightly. A man, disheveled, panicked, and out of place, darted toward the edge of the street. Emma's breath hitched. She wasn't sure if she should call out or keep quiet. Then she noticed the blood. It wasn't a lot, but it streaked the man's hand, dripping faintly onto the sidewalk. "What the?" Emma whispered, her hands trembling as she pulled out her phone. Before she could decide what to do, another sound shattered the eerie calm. A scream. High-pitched, desperate, and not far off. This was no ordinary morning. The next moment felt surreal. A door from a house further down the street flew open, and someone stumbled out, clutching their chest as though they'd been struck. It was Clara, a friendly but quiet neighbor Emma barely knew. Emma flung her door open and dashed toward Clara, her instincts overriding her fear. "Clara, what happened?" Emma gasped, reaching out to steady her. Clara's eyes were wide, her words choked out between labored breaths. He took it. He knows. He knows everything." Emma tried to calm her, but nothing made sense. "Who? What are you talking about?" Clara clung to her like a lifeline, her trembling hand gripping Emma's arm. "Please," she begged, "don't let him get away. If he does, none of us are safe." That was the beginning. And Emma, with no idea what she was stepping into, was about to unravel secrets that would thrust her into a world she never thought possible. Emma's heart raced as Clara slumped against her, still muttering fragments of warnings. She scanned the neighborhood, her gaze darting to where the man had disappeared moments earlier. The quiet streets, so familiar and unthreatening, now felt like the backdrop of something sinister. "We need to call the police," Emma said firmly, pulling Clara toward her porch. Clara's knees buckled, and Emma barely managed to steady her. "No!" Clara cried, clutching Emma's wrist with surprising strength. Her voice was raw with desperation. "They won't understand. They can't. He knows how to stay hidden." "Then tell me what's going on," Emma demanded, her tone sharper than intended. Clara's pale face twisted with hesitation, but before she could answer, a faint sound of an engine revving broke through the early morning quiet. Emma turned just in time to see a black sedan tearing down the street. "That's him," Clara rasped, her voice barely audible over the roar of the car speeding away. "He has it. The file. It's everything." Emma didn't understand, but the panic in Clara's eyes ignited something within her. She couldn't just stand there. Without thinking, Emma bolted toward her car parked in the driveway. "Stay here," she yelled over her shoulder as she jumped into the driver's seat. "What are you doing?" Clara screamed, staggering forward. "Emma, stop. You don't know what you're getting into." Emma hesitated for a fraction of a second, her hands gripping the wheel. "If he's that dangerous, I'm not letting him get away," she called back. And with that, she tore out of the driveway, the tires screeching as she floored the gas pedal. The chase was reckless. The sedan was fast, weaving through the narrow suburban roads like a snake through tall grass. Emma stayed close, her heart pounding in sync with the roar of her engine. Every corner she rounded, every glimpse of the taillights ahead, made her wonder if she was completely out of her depth. What could this man possibly have stolen that Clara thought was worth risking everything to get back? A file? It didn't make sense. The sedan suddenly veered onto a dirt road leading toward the outskirts of town, kicking up clouds of dust. Emma gritted her teeth and followed, her car bouncing over the uneven terrain. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, and she glanced at the screen. Clara. Ignoring it, she kept her focus on the sedan ahead, now slowing as it approached an old warehouse looming in the distance. Emma killed her headlights and parked a safe distance away, her chest heaving. The man stepped out of the sedan, glancing around nervously before slipping into the building. She hesitated. Her rational mind screamed at her to turn back, to call the authorities, but something stronger, some deep, unrelenting need to see this through, pushed her forward. Emma crept toward the warehouse, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dirt and gravel. The building loomed before her, its rusted walls and shattered windows exuding a foreboding presence. She slipped through a side door left ajar, her breath catching as she stepped inside. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint stench of mildew. The faint hum of machinery buzzed in the distance. Emma moved cautiously, her eyes scanning the shadows. And then she saw him. The man stood near a table, rifling through a stack of documents. His back was to her, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. Whatever he was looking for, it was urgent. Before Emma could decide what to do, the man's phone rang, and he answered with a terse, "I have it. Meet me at the docks in an hour." His voice was low but filled with urgency. Emma's pulse quickened. Whoever he was talking to, this wasn't some petty theft. This was bigger, much bigger. As the man ended the call, Emma's foot shifted, and a loose piece of metal clattered to the floor. His head snapped around, his eyes locking onto hers with a predatory intensity that froze her in place. "You shouldn't be here," he growled, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. Emma's throat went dry, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "What did you take from Clara?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. The man smirked, his eyes narrowing. "You don't even know what you've walked into, do you?" Emma barely had time to react before he lunged, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. She stumbled back, her hand brushing against a rusted pipe on the wall. Without thinking, she grabbed it and swung. The impact sent him reeling, but it wasn't enough to stop him. As he recovered, Emma sprinted toward the exit, her heart hammering in her chest. She burst out into the open air, her lungs burning, and made a beeline for her car. She had to warn Clara. Whatever was in that file wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. And now she was caught in the middle of it. Emma's tires screeched as she sped back toward the neighborhood, her mind racing faster than the car. Her hands gripped the wheel tightly, the rusted pipe she'd swung earlier now sitting on the passenger seat, smeared with dirt and a faint trace of blood. She couldn't shake the man's words. "You don't even know what you've walked into." Her phone buzzed incessantly. Clara was calling again. Emma picked it up, pressing the speaker button while keeping her eyes on the road. "What the hell did you get me into, Clara?" Emma snapped, her voice trembling with anger and adrenaline. "What's in that file?" Clara's voice was ragged, almost drowned out by her frantic breathing. "Emma, you need to get back here now. We're not safe. They'll come after you too if they know you've seen him. I need answers first." "What's in the file?" Emma demanded, swerving to avoid a trash bin near the curb. Clara's silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then, finally, she whispered, "It's proof. Of everything. What they've done. What they'll keep doing if it isn't exposed. What they—" Emma pressed, glancing in her rearview mirror to ensure she wasn't being followed. "The people who think they're untouchable," Clara said, her voice cracking. "The kind of people who make people like us disappear when we get too close to the truth." Emma's stomach dropped. This wasn't just some neighborhood spat or petty theft. She'd stumbled into something far bigger than she'd imagined. When Emma reached Clara's house, the street was eerily quiet, bathed in the dull glow of streetlights. Clara was pacing on her front porch, her face pale and her eyes darting nervously. Emma barely had the car in park before she jumped out. "You need to start talking now," she said, striding toward Clara. "What's in that file and why does he have it?" Clara hesitated, then gestured for Emma to come inside. She locked the door behind them and drew the curtains, her hands shaking. "It's evidence," Clara began, her voice hushed but urgent. "A paper trail that links a pharmaceutical company to illegal experiments. They've been testing on people, vulnerable people, without consent. Homeless shelters, hospitals, even prisons. And they're covering up the deaths." Emma's knees felt weak. "You're serious," she said, more a statement than a question. Clara nodded. "I found out by accident. My sister worked for them." She discovered what they were doing and tried to blow the whistle. 2 weeks later, she was dead. They called it a car accident, but her voice broke and tears welled in her eyes. Emma sat down heavily on the couch, her mind reeling. So, this guy, he's working for them? No, Clara said, shaking her head. He was supposed to help me expose them. A journalist. But I think he's turned. They must have gotten to him. He wasn't supposed to take the file. He was supposed to publish it. Emma buried her face in her hands. This wasn't just dangerous. It was catastrophic. Why didn't you go to the police? I tried, Clara said, her voice bitter. But they're in on it. Or at least some of them are. The few who aren't don't have the power to take on something this big. This file is the only leverage we have. Before Emma could respond, a loud knock echoed through the house. Both women froze. Clara's face drained of color. They're here. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a low voice. Ms. Dawson, we know you're inside. Open the door and no one gets hurt. Emma's blood turned cold. She gestured for Clara to stay quiet, then grabbed the rusted pipe she'd brought from the warehouse. Clara pointed toward the back door, mouthing, we can slip out. Emma nodded, gripping the pipe tightly as they crept toward the kitchen. The pounding on the door grew more insistent, and the voice turned threatening. You've got 3 seconds before we come in ourselves. Clara opened the back door as quietly as she could, but just as they stepped outside, a beam of light from a flashlight caught them. Over here, a voice shouted. Emma didn't wait. Run! She yelled, grabbing Clara's arm and pulling her toward the alley behind the house. They sprinted into the shadows, the sound of footsteps and shouting growing louder behind them. Emma's lungs burned, and her legs ached, but she didn't dare slow down. Clara stumbled, nearly falling, but Emma caught her and dragged her forward. Ahead, the alley opened onto a busy street. We need to get to my car, Emma panted. It's the only way out. No, Clara gasped. They'll be watching the roads. We need to lay low until we can figure out our next move. Where? Emma demanded, glancing over her shoulder. Their pursuers were getting closer, their silhouettes just visible in the dim light. There's an old factory on the east side of town, Clara said. It's abandoned. We can hide there. Emma didn't argue. They veered off toward the factory, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The shouts behind them began to fade, but Emma knew it was only a matter of time before they were found again. When they finally reached the factory, Emma shoved the heavy door open, and they slipped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the faint hum of distant machinery sent a shiver down her spine. Clara collapsed onto the floor, clutching her side. We can't keep running like this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We need to fight back. Emma sank to the ground beside her, her mind racing. Then tell me how. Because right now, all I see are 2 people in over their heads. Clara met her gaze, her expression hardening. We still have one thing they don't. What's that? Emma asked. Hope, Clara said. And the truth. As long as we have those, we still have a chance. Emma wasn't sure she believed her, but one thing was clear. They were in this together now. And whatever it took, they weren't going down without a fight. The factory was a labyrinth of broken-down machinery, rusted pipes, and shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. Emma helped Clara to her feet, both of them scanning the dim interior. The air smelled stale like metal and forgotten years. Emma's grip on the rusted pipe tightened. How long do you think we have before they find us? She whispered. Clara shook her head, wiping sweat from her brow. Not long. They're relentless. We need to plan our next move now. Emma glanced at her phone. No signal. Typical. We can't stay here forever, she said. If they're after the file, they're not stopping until they have it, or us. Clara hesitated, then pulled a small USB drive from her jacket pocket. It gleamed faintly in the dim light, an unassuming object that held the weight of their survival. This is everything, she said, her voice trembling. Names, dates, evidence of payments, it's enough to take them down. If we can get it into the right hands. Emma stared at the drive, the enormity of the situation hitting her all over again. You were carrying it this whole time? Clara nodded. I thought I could trust him, the journalist. But after he took the file, I couldn't risk him destroying this too. Emma took a deep breath, her mind racing. We need to upload this somewhere. Make it public before they catch up to us. Do you know anyone who can help? There's someone, Clara said hesitantly. An old friend of my sister's. He's a hacker, paranoid, but brilliant. If anyone can get this out safely, it's him. Emma nodded. Then we find him. What's his name? Dev, Clara said. But reaching him won't be easy. He doesn't trust anyone. He'll need proof we're not a threat. Emma smirked, despite the gravity of their situation. We're running for our lives. If that's not proof enough, I don't know what is. Hours later, as dawn broke over the crumbling skyline of the city, Emma and Clara sat huddled in the corner of a public library, using an outdated computer. Emma's fingers flew across the keyboard as Clara dictated the location of Dev's underground hideout, a disused maintenance tunnel beneath an old subway station. He's off the grid, Clara explained. No phone, no email. If we're lucky, he'll be there. Emma frowned. And if we're not? Then we're screwed, Clara said bluntly. They printed out a rough map of the subway lines and headed back into the city. Emma's nerves were frayed, her body aching from the events of the past 24 hours. Every time they stepped onto a street, she felt eyes on her, like the shadowy figures chasing them were just out of view. By the time they reached the abandoned subway entrance, Emma's nerves were shot. The iron gate blocking the tunnel was chained shut, but Clara produced a small bolt cutter from her bag, a tool she'd grabbed on their way out of the factory. You've come prepared, Emma muttered. I've had to, Clara replied, her voice grim. The chain snapped with a loud clang, and they slipped inside. The darkness swallowed them immediately, the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the tunnel. Emma pulled out her phone, using its flashlight to guide the way. This place screams, bad idea, Emma muttered. Clara didn't respond. Her focus was on the faint markings along the walls, symbols and arrows that only someone familiar with the path would recognize. After what felt like hours of navigating the maze-like tunnels, they reached a heavy steel door with a keypad. This is it, Clara whispered, stepping forward. She tapped a sequence of numbers into the pad, her hands shaking slightly. The door hissed open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with computer monitors, cables, and stacks of old equipment. A figure emerged from the shadows, a wiry man with glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. His hair was a mess, and his expression was a mix of suspicion and irritation. Clara, he said, his voice low. What the hell are you doing here? Dev, we need your help, Clara said, stepping forward. She held up the USB drive. This is it. The proof. Dev's eyes narrowed as he looked at the drive, then at Emma. And who's she? A friend, Clara said quickly. She saved my life. Dev crossed his arms, clearly unimpressed. You're putting me in a lot of danger just showing up here. If they're after you, they'll be after me soon enough. We don't have a choice, Clara said, her voice pleading. You're the only one I trust with this. Dev sighed, running a hand through his hair. You realize this could get us all killed, right? Clara nodded. I know, but if we don't expose them, more people will die. Dev studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Fine, let me see it. As Dev worked to decrypt the files, Emma and Clara sat in tense silence, every sound from outside the hideout making their nerves jump. Hours passed, and finally, Dev leaned back in his chair, a grim look on his face. This is big, he said. Bigger than I thought. If we release this, it's gonna shake things up and paint massive targets on all of us. That's a risk we're willing to take, Clara said firmly. Dev glanced at Emma. You too? You're willing to put your life on the line for this? Emma hesitated, then nodded. Someone has to. Dev turned back to his monitors. All right, let's make some noise. Dev's fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard, his face illuminated by the glow of multiple screens. The USB drive's contents were displayed in full. Spreadsheets, memos, emails, and scanned documents linking the pharmaceutical company to illegal human trials and a string of cover-ups. Emma's chest tightened as she read through the damning evidence. Lives destroyed. Families left without answers. This was a reckoning waiting to happen. This isn't just noise, Dev muttered, his tone grim. This is a war cry. Once I release this, there's no going back. Then do it, Clara said. Her voice steady despite the tension in the room. It's time. Dev paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. I'll send it to a few whistleblower networks and independent journalists. We need to spread this wide so they can't suppress it. But once it's out there, we're all in their crosshairs. Just do it, Emma urged, her hands clenched into fists. She didn't care about the risks anymore. Too many lives had already been destroyed. They couldn't let fear stop them now. With a final keystroke, Dev launched the files into cyberspace. The screen flashed as the data uploaded to encrypted servers. It was done. The truth was out. For a moment, there was silence, the gravity of what they'd just done settling over them like a heavy weight. Then, Dev's phone buzzed. He picked it up, his expression darkening as he read the message. They know, he said simply. A loud crash outside the steel door made all three of them jump. Emma grabbed the rusted pipe she'd carried since the warehouse, her heart hammering. Clara backed into a corner, her eyes wide with fear. How did they find us so fast? Emma whispered. They've been tracking Clara, Dev said, already packing up his gear. I should have seen it sooner. They must have planted something on her. I don't have anything on me. Clara protested, but Dev ignored her, yanking cables from his computers and shoving hardware into a bag. We can't stay here, Dev said, his voice tight. There's another way out, an old service tunnel. Follow me. The door shuddered as another impact rattled the hinges. Emma glanced at Clara, who was pale but resolute. Let's go, Emma urged, gripping Clara's arm as Dev led the way into a narrow passage hidden behind a stack of crates. The tunnel was cramped and pitch black, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Emma's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a maze of pipes and debris. Behind them, the sound of the steel door being breached echoed ominously. They're inside, Clara hissed, panic creeping into her voice. Keep moving, Dev said sharply, his tone leaving no room for argument. The group emerged from the tunnel into an alley several blocks away. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city. Dev checked his phone, his fingers flying over the screen. The files are trending, he said. It's everywhere now. They can't stop it. That doesn't mean they won't try to stop us, Emma said, scanning the street for any sign of pursuit. Dev nodded grimly. We need to split up. They'll expect us to stay together. Emma shook her head. No, we're stronger as a group. Stronger, yes, but easier to find, Dev countered. I've done my part. Now it's up to you two to stay alive long enough to see this through. Clara hesitated, then stepped forward, pulling Dev into a hug. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, Dev muttered. Get out of here. Both of you. Reluctantly, Emma and Clara turned and headed toward a nearby bus station. They didn't speak as they boarded a bus heading out of the city, their faces drawn and exhausted. Emma watched the city skyline recede into the distance, her mind replaying the events of the past day. They had exposed the truth, but at what cost? 2 weeks later, the fallout was undeniable. The files had sparked an international scandal. The pharmaceutical company's executives were arrested, whistleblowers stepped forward, and protests erupted worldwide. The story dominated headlines, with journalists uncovering even more atrocities tied to the corporation. Emma and Clara watched from the safety of a small, remote cabin provided by one of Dev's contacts. It wasn't much, but it was safe. For now. Do you think it's over? Clara asked one night, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace. Emma shook her head. No, people like that don't give up easily. But they've been exposed. The world knows now. That's a start. Clara nodded, her expression thoughtful. We couldn't have done it without you. Emma smiled faintly. We couldn't have done it without each other. As the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Emma felt a sense of peace for the first time in weeks. They had risked everything to fight for justice, and while the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. They had made a difference. and sometimes that was enough.